On this episode of Hoosier Adventures, we check out the National Video Game Museum in Frisco, Texas. This is a strong recommend. I really enjoyed my time here at the National Video Game Museum. So the main body of the museum is exhibits, that kind of thing, but you actually exit out into an arcade. You get 4 arcade tokens with the price of admission. I don't have any footage of the arcade, so I'll go ahead and talk about that now while we're here at the beginning. One of the things that I enjoyed, they have an actual Punch-Out machine, so I got to play Punch-Out in the arcade. That was pretty cool. Also played some Gauntlet. They don't have any rare and hard-to-find video games, mostly, but they do have some really great ones. And there's the man, the myth, the legend, Mario. The museum has a great collection of hard-to-find memorabilia. You'll notice there's a copy of Stadium Events. You can't talk about rare video games without talking about Stadium Events for the NES. Who knows how many tens of thousands of dollars that game might be worth right now at any given time. You'll see a copy of Snatcher down there for the Sega CD. Everyone talks this game up. I've never gotten to play it. I never had a Sega CD as a kid, nor do I own one now, but also the game has never really been re-released, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the plot is just lifted from Blade Runner. You're basically playing a video game based on the movie Blade Runner, so I doubt they can really get the rights. This is a Atari Lynx that has Marlboro cigarettes sponsorship. So yeah, that was pretty funny to see. And then you'll see the sewing machine on the left is from the Game Boy sewing peripheral, which I knew existed, but I've never even seen the actual machine, let alone seen it out in the wild. So that was cool to get to see it, get some photos of it, and laugh about it a little bit. Now, up here on the right, you'll notice this Sega Neptune prototype. Now, what the Sega Neptune was just a standalone 32X. So I've never played it, but I have played a 32X before, and the games that I got to play on it were terrible, and from what I can find online, most of the games were terrible. There's some cool stuff from box art from back in the day. You're going to see some really cool box art, especially from the early days of video gaming. I love that Atari ColecoVision and Television box art, especially the Atari box art. Some of it's just beautiful works of art that you can hang on your wall, and then you would plug in the game and find out that it was terrible, and the box art was not in a representation in any way of what the actual gameplay was like. And here are some Hanafuda cards from Nintendo. So Nintendo is an old company. It's been around for over 100 years. They started out making these Hanafuda cards as well as some toys and some other things. And branched off to video games later on. That is a Virtual Boy in box. Now, you're going to get to see a Virtual Boy later on. Maybe I have video of it, maybe I don't. I actually don't remember. But there is a Virtual Boy on display that you can play here at the National Video Game Museum. That was cool. That was worth the price of admission, in my opinion. Had not played a Virtual Boy since it was on display brand new at Target when I was a kid. And honestly, it's not as bad as I remember. I mean, yeah, you don't want to play it for a prolonged period of time. That'll definitely lead to headaches or something like that because of the red screen and the focus and things like that. But the game that they had on display was the Wario game, and it was a lot of fun. I really, really enjoyed it. And, back in the day when it was on display at Target, I think the 2 games I got to try were Mario, the tennis game with Mario characters, as well as the 3D Tetris. Neither of them I don't think were of note. Now, this is a PC engine, so here in North America it's called a TurboGrafx 16. Growing up, I didn't know anybody who had a TurboGrafx 16. Even today, I don't know anyone who has a TurboGrafx 16, but the PC engine was sort of the release of it outside North America, from what I understand, at least definitely in Japan. And here's the Turbo Express, which is a portable TurboGrafx 16. That was a really cool concept back in the day. You may notice these adapters as well as these sort of plugins that allow you to get broadcast television over your system. I remember the Sega Game Gear had one of those as well. Some of my favorite stuff at the museum was actually promotional material, and I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that I'm not familiar with it and I never saw it when I was growing up or even now. I'm not big into video games really, especially not anymore. But this promotional material was something that the general public didn't necessarily have access to. Cool Star Trek pin there. You're going to see a Ghostbusters 2 pin up on the right here in a second. I think that's really cool. There is a large section of this museum dedicated to the Sega Channel. So what the Sega Channel was is the birth of online connectivity in video games. I believe that you could get downloaded games over rudimentary internet. It was the future. It was ahead of its time. It was just kind of a complete failure. I mean, I had never heard of this thing until recently, and it's through various YouTube channels about video games that I've learned about it only after the fact. But there's a large portion of this museum dedicated to it. It actually has, like several walls of stuff here, and for something that was kind of an interesting footnote, I'm glad this museum has so much dedicated to it because, in a way, I mean, it was so far ahead of its time. You think about online connectivity in video games now; it's such a big part of it. Here's a copy of Mario Paint. The television was not on. I was disappointed by this because I've never gotten to use the Super Nintendo mouse. They have a section of the museum that's set up like an old video game store. This would have been the bargain bin. Now here you'll see some of that great box art like I was telling you. They even have a small cash register there, and you can get behind the counter. At first, I was kind of hesitant to do that because, in a real store, you're not supposed to do that. You'll see a cardboard cutout there for E.T. A lot of people say E.T. is the worst video game of all time. It's actually on display here at the Video Game Museum, and you can play a copy of E.T. I don't think it's the worst video game of all time, but it's still of note. And here you're going to see a Vectrex, and this is open and allowed for people to play. I played the Vectrex there for maybe a good half an hour. I love vector graphics, and I've never seen a Vectrex other than this Vectrex here that's on display at the museum. So to finally get to play one was really cool. One of my favorite classic arcade games is actually the Star Wars Atari game, and I love those vector graphics. To me, they're timeless, and they will always be in the future, regardless of the fact of how cool modern graphics are. Vector graphics to me always look like the future. Now here's a section that has to do with portable gaming. It starts out with the most rudimentary kinds of portable games, and it eventually goes up to things that we're probably more familiar with. Here's the Game Boy Advance section. Probably my favorite video game system of all time, I would say, is the Game Boy Advance. I was kind of a late adopter of it. I got an SP, and then they came out with this cool-looking SP that was Nintendo kind of skin. And I wish I would have held off and got that, but it doesn't matter because the games were so good. And here's some Game & Watches. So before the Game Boy, there was the Game & Watch, and you would have one game on this kind of, I don't even know what to call it. It's not really a video game system, but you'd have one game. It was kind of like a Tiger Electronic thing. It was made by Nintendo. And here's Game Gear and the Sega Nomad, which I've never seen before. Here they have one with a box even. And the Atari Lynx and the Gamecom, or as I always like to refer to it, the Game.com. Now, I did know people who had the Gamecom growing up, and they were all disappointed, and I feel like their parents really let them down as children. Of course, the Power Glove. You can't talk about video game controllers without talking about the Power Glove, right? They had one at Funcoland when I was growing up. I don't remember how much it was, but they couldn't give the thing away. By that point, everyone knew it sucked. Nobody wanted it. And they have a wall of game controllers. Now, you'll see some of the more iconic game controllers that we're all familiar with. And then there's some other really obscure stuff. Here over on the right that I've just kind of cut off on the screen. That was a game controller, I believe, for the Apple Pippin. Up here, this number 2 game controller I always thought was cool. It's a special racing game controller for the N64. N64 controller, very controversial in video game history. Some people love it, some people hate it. Overall, it's cool to see the evolution of this. This is my favorite thing I saw at the museum. It is a copy of Typing of the Dead. At first, I didn't know what it was because the screen, the game over screen was on or whatever. And then I kind of stepped away and I was like, "Holy crap! This is Typing of the Dead." And I had always heard of Typing of the Dead. What it is it's House of the Dead, which is a classic Sega light gun game. But you can use the, it's funny to say out loud, you can use the keyboard peripheral for the Sega Dreamcast to kill zombies in the game. So it'll help you with your typing. Like a word will come up and you'll have to, type it in fast before the zombie can kill you. And I played that thing for like half an hour. I knew what it was just from seeing it on YouTube and things like that. Of course, I didn't know anybody who had it back in the day, and it's just so interesting. But as I was playing it, people were walking by kind of looking at me really funny. I don't think they knew what it was. Here's some development kits. So there's one for the Sega Genesis, Sega CD. It's interesting to see these. I don't know, like, I know people collect them and things like that. I don't know what I would do if I had one, because I'm not even sure that some of them you can even play. Here's some Atari box art. I believe these are all 2600 games, and you'll notice there's a Ghostbusters 2 Atari 2600 game over there in the corner. That's insane to me to think about, because, you know, you think about the Atari 2600 being so sort of, we'll say, primitive, and they were still making games for it in 1989 when Ghostbusters 2 came out. I did a little research on that Ghostbusters 2 game, though. I don't think it was released in North America. If you know, though, put it in the comments. But think about that. I mean, people were playing the Atari 2600 in the late 70s, and this is well into the Nintendo age, the age of the NES, and then, you know, in 1989, the Sega Genesis came out. A wall of game consoles. This is actually when you first walk in. So it's cool to see them visualize, see their evolution. One of the things that's interesting that you wouldn't necessarily notice if you were more focusing on the software of, you know, the games and things like that, is how the aesthetics of the game consoles change over time. And that's, you know, purely based on what consumer preference is, I guess, or what design preferences are. You'll notice the Sega Saturn there was $399 when it launched, and here is its competition, the Sony PlayStation, and $299. Some of the information on there is really cool. You can't see it because it's just too small on camera, but it has, you know, what games are considered some of the best, and then what games are the most expensive here on the collector's market now. I had a Nintendo 64 growing up. I loved it, had wonderful memories of it. I know that it hasn't necessarily, quote, aged well, unquote, but still an amazing system. And that was something I thought was interesting. The Sega Dreamcast was only $199 when it came out. I didn't realize that. Something I thought was a little bit funny were these board games. So there's all these different board games based off of video games. Some of them look really cool. Some of them look really lame. That Frogger game, I believe, I had an aunt who had that back in the day. We never played it, but it'd be kind of interesting to see it. And you see some of these kind of laid out here. Again, they seem to vary in how interesting they look. This Pac-Man one over here on the right looks pretty cool. I like how that was visualized. And there's an F-Zero board game. Now, for those of you who don't know what F-Zero is, I assume probably most of you do because you're watching this, you're interested in video games. F-Zero is a launch title for the Super Nintendo that's a futuristic racing game. I don't know how they translated this high-speed futuristic racing game into a board game. I was so curious about that, I went home and Googled it to try to find out some information on it, because how fun would that be to play? I mean, I don't know. They have a section set up like an old bedroom and things like that. Here's some stuff about the Atari home computers. When I think old computer gaming, though, there's only one name that comes to my mind, and that's Commodore. There's this amazing Star Trek poster here for the classic arcade game by Sega for Star Trek. Yeah. Some of this stuff was so cool. So, yeah, definitely recommend.